The world remembered him as a builder, but no one ever asked what it cost to keep building long after you've run out of breath. Every city has its skyline of steel and story. His was made of concrete, stubbornness, and the sound of machines that obeyed before men did. The sign outside read R.H. Caldwell Industries, but those who worked under its hum knew what it really stood for: relentless hours. Richard Caldwell was not born into power. He was born into weather, the kind of poverty that teaches your hands to work before your mind even catches up. His father died young. His mother sold baked goods on corners that forgot her face before sunset, and by 17, he had learned the cruel mathematics of survival. One mistake costs a meal, two cost your dignity. But he built. My God, he built. He began with broken machinery bought from a warehouse liquidation, the kind of rust that laughed at dreams. He worked until the sound of metal grinding became his lullaby. When the machines coughed to life, he swore he heard his father's voice in the noise, a rough kind of blessing that said, "Make it last." And he did. Through the years that followed, the boy who patched engines in the dark became the man who owned factories filled with light. He learned every language money speaks, from the grease of labor to the perfume of investors. Every success came at the expense of something unseen: sleep, family, the small sweetness of mornings that aren't measured in profit margins. Still, he told himself it was worth it because he wasn't just building a company. He was building continuity. He had a son, Daniel, a quiet child with his mother's eyes and his father's spine. Richard raised him the only way he knew, with structure instead of stories, expectation instead of ease. He never taught him how to play, he taught him how to plan. When other fathers took their sons fishing, he took Daniel to the factory floor. Let him watch the belts and pistons sing their metallic hymn. "Every sound you hear," he once told the boy, "was made by someone who decided not to quit." Daniel nodded. He always nodded. But silence has a memory, and children remember the things you never said louder than the things you did. Years passed. Expansion came like a second sunrise. Caldwell Industries became not just a company, but a constellation: logistics, manufacturing, distribution, an empire built brick by brick, choice by choice. And every brick had his fingerprint. He was meticulous. Even in triumph, he was suspicious of applause. Contracts had to be airtight. Competitors were to be studied like predators. He wrote clauses that other men laughed at: fail-safes, fallback trusts, the quiet architecture of control that hid beneath the public applause of succession. He said it was prudence. The board called it paranoia. Both were right. When his wife died, Daniel's mother, the empire was at its peak. He buried her beneath a tree they planted before their first warehouse opened. It was the only place he ever allowed. After that, grief became a language he only spoke to himself, in the dark behind locked doors. Daniel was 28 when Richard began grooming him to take over. The boy had grown into a man who wore power like a suit tailored by inheritance. He spoke the vocabulary of ambition fluently: market share, capital flows, equity multipliers. Yet when he talked about people, something was missing. Compassion, perhaps. Or maybe just the humility that sweat teaches when you've worked with your hands. Still, Richard believed in blood. He always had. He began stepping back, not because he wanted rest, but because he wanted continuity. He told himself that legacy was not control, it was trust. The board smiled. The markets approved. The world clapped politely for another changing of guards that looked graceful from the outside. But on the inside, a different shift had begun. Daniel married soon after taking over, a woman named Sienna, all charm and precision. She had the posture of someone raised among chandeliers, and the voice of someone who never had to shout to be heard. To the world, she was refinement. To the staff, she was distance. She entered the Caldwell legacy as if it were a set piece in her own theater, adjusting what didn't sparkle, replacing what didn't match. And Richard, proud, cautious, observant, began to see the house he built, learning new habits. Meetings that once began with handshakes now began with briefings. Policies became rebranding. Tradition was now restructuring. The Christmas gatherings that once filled the Great Hall with workers and their families were replaced by curated events with PR photographers and champagne menus. He didn't protest. He simply watched. Because men like Richard don't shout when they lose ground, they measure it. The first rail crack appeared on a Sunday morning. He was sitting in the garden with his tea, the sunlight folding through the leaves in the same pattern his wife used to love. His phone buzzed on the table. A small soft sound that would redraw the map of everything he'd built. The message was from Daniel. Dad, we'll be hosting Sienna's family for dinner tonight. You won't be joining us. She prefers to keep it only for her family. There it was, betrayal wearing courtesy like a mask. He read it twice, then a third time, not because he hadn't understood, but because some sentences have to wound slowly before they finish their work. He set the phone down gently, the way you place something fragile you no longer recognize. The house around him was silent, too silent. The walls that once echoed with the noise of ambition now felt like witnesses to something unspoken, the exile of the man who had built them. He didn't call. He didn't reply. He simply looked at the photographs lining the mantel. Daniel at 10, Daniel at graduation, Daniel at the ribbon cutting of the new headquarters. Every frame told the same story, a father proud enough to believe his love was unbreakable. But even the strongest structures can be hollowed by termites of entitlement. He spent that night. Each room carried the scent of memory, dust, polish, the faint ghost of his wife's perfume. By the time dawn arrived, the sun came through the window like an accusation. What have you done with everything you built? He looked out toward the city, the skyline he'd shaped now shining cold and foreign. And for the first time in years, he felt small in the kingdom he had created. Not weak small, that was the beginning. Because that text was never just a message. It was an awakening. It told him what love without gratitude sounds like. What inheritance without humility looks like. And somewhere deep inside the man who once built empires out of ruins, something ancient stirred. Not revenge, not anger, resolve. The builder was awake again. He chose silence the way a surgeon chooses a scalpel. Not because he feared the blood, but because he understood the difference between noise and precision. In the days after the message, the house relearned his footsteps. There were no slammed doors, no late-night calls that boiled into speeches. He surrendered nothing to spectacle. Instead, he arose at dawn the way he had in the years when banks doubted his signature, moving through rooms with the measured calm of a man who knew he could rebuild anything if he had to, even himself. Silence is not surrender. It is time's oldest tool. He set it against pride and watched it work. In the office where the morning light poured itself across the desk like a promise, he reopened the drawers of memory. Folders breathed. Paper remembered his hands. He found the dusty maps of earlier expansions and traced with a fingertip the highways he had convinced to carry his name. He lingered over a ledger from the year the river flooded, and the plant stayed lit because he refused to let water define power. He recalled which suppliers kept him afloat before his credit score learned to pronounce itself. He wrote their names in a fresh notebook under the simple heading, People I Still Owe. He moved to the window and studied the city the way a father studies a face that has started to resemble someone else. The skyline glittered with buildings that pretended money and mercy were the same material. The company headquarters stood there among them, glass stacked upon glass as if transparency were architecture, and not a responsibility. His son now sat in that upper corner office where the light could be arranged by a dial. The widow's message had turned the dial to a color he recognized from storms. He returned to the breakfast table and let mornings do their honest work. The old kettle breathed, the butter softened into obedience. A single egg took shape without asking for applause. If grief crept in, he fed it, then let it wash down the sink. He refused to starve an emotion that would otherwise grow teeth. The days announced themselves. The sun's reign became a rhythm the city learned to mimic. Announcements arrived polished and heavy with the perfume of inevitability. The company was being modernized, the brand refreshed, the future accelerated. Phrases that once meant care now meant speed. Relocated to rooms where glass outnumbered books, and the people who stood to speak used words that stiffened when they should have bent. Power rehearsed itself for a camera that could be edited later. He went back to the plant because walls that remember sweat tell the truth more easily than walls that remember applause. The night shift manager's chair still rocked sympathetically, and the bulletin board still held paper with pushpins that believed in friction. He listened to machines. They spoke a language that does not flatter. He heard the small discordances that creep in when goalposts move faster than maintenance schedules. A conveyor groaned like an old violin. A motor asked for a bearing the way old men ask for grace. The corner workstation wore a stiffness that signals someone thinking of quitting. He took notes the way he used to when success was a rumor and failure had a daily address. He visited vendors who remembered his name as a guarantee. Faces weathered by invoices and faith met him with the wary affection reserved for men who once arrived when the winter was late and payroll was early. He did not ask for gossip. He let silence pull it. Terms had been optimized, which is what people say when the rope is shorter but the load is the same. Forecasts had become the god everyone bowed to even when the altar was built on bad math. A nephew had been placed in a role that used to take a decade of listening to earn. He thanked them for their candor and paid in attention, which remains a currency even when other bills go dry. At home he reread the trust documents. The paper did not tremble. He had tucked the power of pause inside paragraphs that looked like modesty. He revisited the structure like a man checking the pressure in a dam. Control was not the point. Continuity was. He had built a mechanism that could interrupt harm without humiliating the heir. A way to save the roof without tearing out the foundation. He smoothed the pages as if they were a child's hair and returned them to their patient drawer. The son's wife moved across headlines the way winter moves across ponds, varnishing everything into an image. She brought her family closer in and the company farther out, expanding the spotlight until it spilled over edges where humility used to stand watch. Her tone in board notes grew assured, then prescriptive, then dismissive of histories that did not furnish her narrative. If she noticed the old guard watching her the way farmers watch clouds that promise rain without understanding crops, she did not confess it in public. He saw what she could not yet see. Influence is a balloon that floats until it meets weather. Family is not air, it is gravity. Bring your own gravity into a house that already stands, and you either brace the beams or pull the roofline out of true. She was pulling. Perhaps she did not know. Perhaps she had never learned that style becomes stewardship only when it lifts what it touches. He kept his silence, asking it to collect data rather than resentments. He drafted a calendar of listening. Mondays belonged to operations. He walked the line with managers who by their first names and could smell a misaligned belt from 20 paces. Tuesday went to finance. He read the numbers the way a physician reads a chart, not to find a villain but to find the moment the patient began lying to himself. Wednesday he reserved for customers. He visited warehouses where his boxes became other people's promises, and he let them complain. Thursday he spent on legal, where clauses live in burrows and emerge only when the air tastes like consequence. Friday was for the foundation, the quiet organ that used to pump scholarships into neighborhoods that had never learned to expect mail that contained oxygen. He found it underfunded and over-photographed. He did not confront. He corrected the way old carpenters correct, by laying a level across the beam and letting the bubble settle where the eye cannot. He wrote a letter that said nothing a publicist could quote and everything a company could remember. It thanked what deserved thanks and named what deserved names. Waste. Drift. Performance dressed as posture. It was not a rebuke. It was a mirror cleaned with vinegar and patience. When it reached the board, the room shifted a degree toward honesty. Some faces brightened as if someone had opened a window. Others tightened the way people tighten when air tastes like accountability. The son read it privately and felt a childhood he had abandoned knock on his office door. The wife read it with annoyance, then with curiosity, then with unease. Her mother read it and underlined sentences as if underlining could petition reality. The city did not read it. That was the point. He walked the river and let water remind him that speed is nothing without direction. The benches along the path had memorized his weight and did not protest when he asked them to hold a little more. He practiced a memory of his wife he had been avoiding, the one in which she told him that strong men are dangerous only when their strength is not braided to gentleness. He braided it. He stored it. He returned home with pockets heavy and hands steady. At headquarters the choreography changed. The nephew who had found himself in a position too high for his lungs was gently migrated to a role where results, not photos, would train him. The foundation's new gala plans, thick with adjectives and thin on commitments, were tabled and replaced with a list of living needs that a room of quiet women had been carrying on their backs without stipends or hashtags. The procurement schedule was reintroduced to reality, which is to say to lead times, trust, and storms. The brand calendar learned the difference between storytelling and stories told by people who actually survive something. He watched the sun. Leadership is a mirror that first insults and then heals the right kind of man. The sun's shoulders dropped a centimeter, as if a costume had been removed and a uniform donned. He began arriving earlier, Not to be seen but to see. He walked not with cameras but with questions that sounded like learning instead of preparation for a quote. He sat where the welders sat and asked them about noise and heat. He ended meetings with thank you instead of next. An old hand put a thumbprint's worth of approval on the day by nodding without smiling. In that culture it was a standing ovation. He watched the wife. She discovered that the scholarship committee met in a room without windows, and that the best stories did not begin on stage. She learned to listen to a woman who ran a community pantry and could tell you the month a factory closed by the brands of cereal people stopped donating. She went to a school whose paint had been holding on with hope and returned with a face that knew the difference between charity and repair. She cried once, quietly, in a hallway that smelled of old books and disinfectant, and the teacher who saw it pretended not to see because dignity prefers unlit rooms. He still said nothing in public. He scheduled his voice the way a conductor schedules a drum. When he finally spoke at an internal review, the sentence fell into the room like a beam that knew exactly where to land. He did not say we must be like we were. He said we must remember who we are, which is a different instruction. The room did not applaud. It wrote things down. He prepared for the next storm anyway. Markets are weather. Families are weather. Pride is weather. He reviewed the banking covenants in the trust that had slept like an old dog by the fire and would rise when true danger entered. He sharpened the mechanism that could freeze what needed freezing without breaking glass. He checked the ownership of the intellectual property that made the brand valuable beyond sales, ensuring it still lived where a steady hand could reach it. He did not plan a coup. He planned a cushion. He noticed the subtle revenge of small things well done. The cafeteria added back the simple stew the crew loved when money was thin. A manager introduced a monthly meeting where anyone could bring a mistake and leave with a process. Someone moved the founder's portrait from the atrium to the training room, where it could be a presence rather than a worship item. The union steward and an executive who had never spoken past policy stood beside each other watching a new machine learn its first hour without swearing. Across town, a competitor's recruiter began to get fewer calls returned, because staying had regained its dignity. He visited the tree where he had buried his wife, because days like this require witnesses who do not talk back. He told her about the message that had tried to exile him, and he told her about the silence that had brought him home. He told her about the son and how the boy was returning without being asked to bow. He told her about the daughter-in-law and the unlearning that was beginning to look like grace. He left with pockets that no longer weighed him down and a pace that did not need to announce itself. In a corner of his study, the old radio that had accompanied him through nights of invoices and furnace alarms sat like a relic. He turned it on. A station whose announcer still believed in weather reports told him that a front was coming, a moderate one, nothing the river would confess to. He accepted the metaphor. The company would be fine if it remembered that fronts pass and structures remain. The family would be fine if it remembered that chairs are for sitting together, not for standing above. He crafted a private ritual. Every night he wrote 3 lines in a notebook, not as a diary but as a builder's log. Today we listened more than we ordered. Today we chose facts over froth. Today we remembered that names outlive numbers when they are worn honestly. He did not read back. He let accumulation do its quiet arithmetic. He went to a birthday for one of the grandchildren, where sugar and squeals performed an economy that outperforms every index. He stood under a string of paper lanterns that looked like small planets practicing orbit, and realized that the message that tried to ban him from a table had placed him in a chair that sees everything a little more clearly. He cut cake. He wiped a face that would one day learn invoices. He laughed the way men laugh when they realize joy costs less than pride. At quarter's end, the numbers arrived with the modest relief of a fever breaking. Not triumph, not collapse. A turn toward health that offered its hand without insisting on confetti. He thanked the team. He thanked the sun. He thanked the day for consenting to be ordinary again. He did not thank the mirror. He had learned long ago that mirrors do not need gratitude. They need cleaning. The wife came to see him one afternoon, not to request, not to declare, but to return something she had borrowed without knowing it. It was not an object. It was a tone. She spoke in a register that carried the weight of rooms where outcomes visit and stay. She asked for advice, not permission. She left with a list of names to call who would teach her without needing her spotlight. He watched her go and imagined a future conversation with his wife under the tree, in which he would summarize this moment simply. The girl has found the difference between taste and duty. He slept. He woke. He kept the rituals that make men durable without making them hard. He walked the river and let patience outpace regret. He drove to the plant and pretended not to hear his name whispered with a softness that is better than applause. He visited the office and sat in a chair that used to teach him why his back hurt. He stood behind the sun at a window that turned the city into geometry, and let him narrate the day as if narration had been invented that morning. He corrected only once in a sentence nobody else would have heard, and it was enough. He held on to the trust not as a weapon but as a weather vane. In case the wind shifted. In case arrogance restarted its engines. In case the family forgot again what tables are for. The mechanism slept. He allowed it to sleep. Power that is put away is power that prefers wisdom. The message remained printed and filed in a folder labeled weather. He looked at it from time to time the way an old mariner glances at a barometer out of habit. It no longer burned. It instructed. It told him that love without scaffolding collapses under the strain of ambition. It told him that fathers must not only forgive, they must also to stand without becoming decoration. It told him that an empire is not a throne, it is a roof. Roofs keep rain from children's hair. Thrones keep men from seeing their feet. He chose the roof. As spring rehearsed its opening act outside his window, the company rehearsed its steadiness. Trucks departed on time with cargo that did not need stories to justify its worth. Employees went home at a reasonable hour without feeling like betrayal. The foundation sent letters that began with "We saw you" rather than "We are proud of ourselves." The headline writers lost interest. He considered that a signature, and yet he prepared. Storms do not ask for appointments. He worked with counsel to confirm that the trigger points in the operating agreement still held where the wood meets the stone. He asked an accountant who smelled of pencil shavings and decency to review the layers of ownership that kept bright objects from being pawned during dark moods. He updated his letter to the future board, removing language that could be mistaken for scolding and replacing it with language that could not be misunderstood as permission for drift. He placed it in the same drawer as the trust. The drawer closed without argument. He took one last walk through the plant before the next act began. He traced his hand over a railing polished by 1,000 gloved hands that had steadied 1,000 bodies through fatigue and purpose. He paused by a machine that had outlived 2 business cycles and a marriage and nodded to it the way you nod to elders in certain cultures. He looked at the exit doors and remembered the night of the fire and the morning after when ash had still been in his hair while he signed the first check to rebuild. He breathed in metal and oil and effort and called it holy without saying the word. When he stepped outside, the afternoon light had shifted to that bronze hour when even warehouses look like cathedrals. He stood in it like a man who knows that gold is not a color. It is a temperature. The next season was coming. It would ask more of everyone as seasons do. The son had learned to hold the chair without digging his fingers into the upholstery. The wife had learned that a last name is not a key but a responsibility. The workers had learned, again, that dignity and competence mate for life. The father had learned nothing new except the only thing that ever matters, that foundations remember, and that if you give them time, they will teach the house how to stand. He drove home without turning on the radio. The car hummed the way good tools hum when used properly. At a red light he watched a flock of small birds decide and then undecided and then align, a choreography of survival disguised as play. He smiled without needing a witness. At home, the porch light he always left on for others greeted him, as if to remind him he was not a man returning from war but a builder returning from inspection. He poured tea. He held the cup as if it were the first cup and the last. He sat at the desk where the drawer held paper that could save them all from themselves if necessary. He did not feel powerful. He felt ready. He felt ready. In the quiet that followed, he recognized the exact moment when silence finished its work and yielded the stage to consequence. The city exhaled. The company exhaled. The house exhaled. The man exhaled. The phone on the desk did not glow. It did not need to. He already knew the next act had begun. And somewhere across town, in the glass office where airships still practiced the art of listening, a young executive looked into the reflective night and saw 2 figures in the glass. One was a boy who had wanted to impress his father. The other was a man who now wanted to learn from him. In the space between those 2 figures, an old Claus slept and smiled. The builder closed his notebook for the night. The page was full. The day had been honest. The future stood on the other side of the door, not impatient, just present. He rose, turned off the light, and let the house hold him in a darkness that felt like trust. He was ready for the reckoning that would not require shouting. He was ready for the turn he had not choreographed so much as invited. He was ready, finally, to let the roof prove itself in rain. The season turned without asking permission. Heat pressed into steel, and steel remembered what it meant to hold shape when everything around it wanted to soften. The company moved in its routines, forklifts mapping a choreography learned from years of repetition, schedules working in spreadsheets that taught hours where to stand. But beneath the ordinary rhythm, a tremor began to thread itself through the week, a frequency that only those who've ridden out collapses recognize, the room's air starting to feel thin, the numbers taking longer to answer questions they used to greet like old friends. The sun's crown gleamed, but polish cannot disguise weight forever. The message that had tried to exile a father did not disappear. It altered gravity. It taught silence how to carry resolve instead of resentment. It taught the old clauses where to sleep and when to wake. It taught mercy the shape of a blade that cuts infection free without spilling more blood than a future can afford. The shattering did not arrive as a crash. It arrived as a redefinition of thresholds, what the board would accept, what the brand could survive, and what the family still deserved to be called. It began at the edges, the way shorelines announce erosion. Vendors who once extended grace began charging interest measured in caution. A shipment missed its connection through a hub that used to handle Caldwell containers like favors, and the call explaining it came with a tone that had learned fatigue. The foundation posted a photograph of ribbon and smiles, and was met with a comment from a mother who wanted to know why the scholarship check had not cleared while the champagne had. In the plant, a sensor that had never lied before started reporting temperatures that did not match the machine's breath. The data team plotted it and called it noise. The floor called it a warning. The sun's wife widened her orbit. She moved through rooms like a season intent on proving it had arrived, crisp syllables and elegant certainty in places that used to prefer verbs softer than command. She recruited cousins as if genetics could perform stewardship, and she rearranged decision-making so outcomes could pose for photographs. She did not understand that some pictures are receipts for debt rather than evidence of wealth. She did not know that applause ages poorly where competence is required daily. In certain corridors, eyes began to lower when she passed, not in deference, in conservation. The builder did not intervene loudly. He stood in the wind the way old trees do, still to the eye, muscular in the fibers no one sees. He felt the pressure in the trust like a barometer explaining rain without panic. He read the weekly cash report as if it were a face that had learned to lie and was tired of the effort. He placed the ledger of mercy beside the ledger of control and let both advise him in the voice of experience, the kind that knows how to wait without betraying the future. A quarter closed. The numbers did not collapse. They staggered. Margins narrowed as if reluctant to be seen with the company in public. One unit that had once carried the weight of two now required propping from three. The sun called it temporary turbulence and offered a calendar as proof that storms move on when scheduled. The board, which had practiced enthusiasm through worse, looked toward the builder the way a ship looks toward a lighthouse it pretended not to need. He did not move. Lighthouses do not run toward ships. They keep their appointment with distance. In the quiet rooms where paper keeps score, the covenants were measured. There is a music to well-written agreements. They hum when pressure finds them and grow silent when flattery tries to bribe them. The trust had slept under a layer of dust that was not neglect but confidence. Now it is stirred. It did not threaten. It reminded me. It reminded banks that their risk was collateralized not by a surname pretending to be a guarantee, but by structure that had outlived last decade's fashions. It reminded the licensing engine that bled brand into product that it answered to chartered purpose, not curated posture. It reminded the chair that the chair is furniture, not a monarch. The first move looked like nothing, an instruction that certain outflows would require a secondary signature until the quarter's rhythm restored itself. It was written in neutral ink and arrived without exclamation points. The second move looked like prudence, a scheduled review of suppliers whose terms had been tightened by style rather than safety. The third move looked like courtesy, a conversation with counsel about the clause that allowed a temporary stewardship board to stand up between harm and habit without dishonoring either. None of these moves arrived with sirens. They arrived with the patient dignity of systems designed by sweat. The sun felt the temperature change as a man feels weather through a well-made coat. He did not freeze. He adjusted. He started appearing in rooms at minutes that were not prepared to be inspected. 2 before shift, 6 after closing, and measured the day by the way people's shoulders settled when he stood beside them. He discovered that spreadsheets had removed friction from his understanding and reintroduced friction by listening to wrenches complain. He tasted the truth that emerges in rooms where outcomes argue with excuses, and the only applause is work finished to the satisfaction of those who must rely on it tomorrow. The wife felt the change as a dimming at the edges of rooms that used to brighten upon her arrival. Authority that was once borrowed began asking to see identification it would accept only from results. Her cousins reported back with vocabulary that had begun to sound like bruises, process, compliance, audit, and her confidence met them with disbelief before it met them with respect. Her mother called fewer times, and when she did, the conversation ended with silence that did not need translation. The mirror in her dressing room discovered that glass can comfort or convict depending on the day. There is a moment in every storm when denial runs out of path. It arrived in the form of a forecast from a client who had once treated Caldwell lead times as a fact of nature. They were moving 3 contracts to a competitor whose pitch had sharpened while Caldwell rehearsed brightness. The math was not mortal, but it was an X-ray. Entertainment had been paid with attention owed to discipline. The son read the forecast in the conference room where the table had been chosen for its ability to reflect cleanly, and for a breath he saw his face not as a leader's, only as a man's. He folded the paper and placed it back down without looking at his hands. He understood now why his father kept a bench by the river. The builder moved then, not toward the microphone but toward the lever only a founder can pull without tearing the fabric. The stewardship board woke with a letter of appointment written years earlier in the grammar of goodwill. It did not replace the son. It surrounded him with elders whose competence had survived their ambition. Payments exceeding thresholds paused as a courtesy to prudence. License renewals awaited sign-off from charters that had been drafted to protect essence from the temporary charm of shortcuts. The brand's core scripts, those few lines that taught every hand what this name means when printed on a box, were reread aloud in rooms where slogans had been drowning out O's. On the floor, the pause felt like someone had taken a finger off a pulse and placed a stethoscope over the heart instead. Work continued, but with listening threaded through it. Wages did not slip. Morale did not break. The only thing squeezing was waste. The only thing freezing was drift. In procurement, a contract written by a relative who loved adjectives more than service met a calendar that did not. The contract shrank without drama and returned to the drawer as a lesson instead of a badge. In the foundation, checks cleared before photographs even remembered their angles. The wife's family arrived at the edge of the board's table with a posture that had earned them nothing and demanded remarks that had not been rehearsed for truth. The table offered water, not applause. The air did not change temperature for them. Their entitlement met the quiet of a room that had grown allergic to performance. They discovered that the empire was not an inheritance but a shelter, and that shelters require maintenance that cannot be outsourced to pedigree. The son's face learned a new discipline, holding disappointment without outsourcing it to blame. He sat with the elders in a session where minutes were taken by someone who remembered when minutes were recorded to protect the disempowered rather than to justify the decision-makers. He presented what he had thought, what he had tried, where he had mistaken attention for momentum. He did not self-flagellate. He did not charm. He spoke with the kind of accuracy that allows a story to disarm a bomb. The elders nodded with the economy of men and women who had built and rebuilt more than once. The builder watched and withheld the impulse to rescue. There is a cruelty in unearned rescue. It steals the scar that teaches. He placed his hand on the trust not to clutch it, to remind his body that structure exists so love can afford patience. The clauses did their work. They reduced risk to a size that competence could lift. They returned decision-making to a cadence that sleep could share without guilt. They allowed the son to suffer the embarrassment required for humility without paying interest to catastrophe. In the market, competitors sniffed the air the way animals do when distant thunder intrigues them. They moved closer to the fence and peered over. They saw work continuing, pallets departing, managers speaking in sentences that made sense. They heard no rumors worth investing in. They went home. The storm was still a storm, but it had met a landscape that refused to flood itself. The shattering arrived not as a single break but as a series of honest noises. The wife, entering the office where the scholarship list had finally outrun the gala slideshow, realized that generosity had taught her something fashion never would, that service is a mirror that returns you either as a citizen or spectator. She chose citizens and canceled an event that would have purchased praise with time stolen from the urgent. Her mother disapproved with a silence that sounded like exile. She survived it. In the plant, a memorial notice appeared on the board for a line worker who had taught 3 supervisors how to listen before measuring. The gathering in the break room looked like a function until it sounded like family. The son stood at the back and learned how grief becomes policy when men who cared about a person asked the question that outlives flowers: what can we change so the next man goes home safer? A small guardrail appeared on a platform 3 days later. No press release noticed it. The future did. There is a kind of clarity that only follows exhaustion, the moment when the mind stops arguing with fact and begins working with it. It arrived one evening when the builder stood in the old office that smelled faintly of metals and memory, and reviewed the 3 ledgers of his life: the books, the body, the heart. The books told him the worst had been prevented and the repair had begun. The body told him he was tired in a way that did not require rest, only meaning. The heart told him the text that tried to erase him had instead edited him into the right paragraph. A father who had finally learned how to love without being needed to be obeyed. He filed the quarter's summary in the drawer where weather keeps its lessons. He folded the page with the client forecast and clipped it to a plan that replaced performance theater with scheduling discipline, sponsorship with service, slogans with procedures you could teach in under an hour and test without bias. He wrote a short instruction to the stewardship board in a hand that had not changed since invoices were carbon duplicates. Keep the pause where it protects pride from replacing purpose. Release the pause where it prevents learning from becoming ownership. He signed it because signatures are not vanity, they are footprints. The next morning opened with a sky that could not decide which kind of day it wanted to be. Light came in through the plant windows like advice. The company worked. The trucks lined up like sentences that knew their verbs. The office moved with the quiet coordination of a kitchen where meals are prepared by people who know which knife to reach for without looking. The son walked without an entourage. The wife sat with a woman who ran spreadsheets that predicted hunger and learned why decimal points are ethical decisions. The builder stood by a doorway he had entered through thousands of times and felt the difference between sovereignty and stewardship. Sovereignty owns. Stewardship answers. And then the smallest noise. A notification on a device that other men carried to feel important, and this man carried because he had learned that even seasoned hands must attend to detail. A bank acknowledged that the covenants remained green, that the trust's interventions had been received as collaboration rather than coup, that the maturity profile now hugged the calendar like a belt that fit properly again. Not triumph, not fanfare, merely the removal of dread. He placed the device face down. His breath had already answered. The shattering completed itself in a place no camera visits. The son sat alone after hours at the table that had reflected 100 faces pretending certainty and allowed himself to understand what the message to his father had cost, not in pride, not in image, but in the slow ache of a bloodline mispronouncing itself. He did not send an apology as a performance. He wrote a note in terms his father would respect, actions described, not emotions advertised. He placed it in the folder where stewardship keeps track of what it has learned. He left the building without touching the light switches. Darkness knew its job. In the house that had once tried to feel too big for one man, and now felt exactly right for a man who had finally sized himself correctly, the builder sat in the room where the old radio slept. He turned the dial to find a station that still told the time at the top of the hour like a promise. He listened to the announcement with the reverence he used to reserve for invoices. Time had always been his first investor, and his most unforgiving auditor. Tonight it felt like a partner again. He rose and walked the hallway where photographs stored versions of him that he had outlived and yet would always carry. He paused at the frame where a younger hand grasped a smaller hand outside a warehouse that had since become 3. He let the memory do what it was designed to do, not chain him to a perfection that never existed, but harness him to a patience he could still practice. He turned off the light and let the dark hold shape instead of threat. Outside, the sky shifted into the blue that teaches windows how to glow. The city stretched and yawned and returned to its negotiations with fortune. The company slept inside alarms that had been set by people who respected what sleep is for. The family took its seats at a table that would no longer confuse chairs for thrones. The builder lay down, not to command his body to rest, but to permit it. The text that had once installed a wall had become an arch. The shattering had not ended the house. It showed the beams. Beams are not beautiful to people who need chandeliers to feel wealthy. They are beautiful to builders. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow would ask for him again, not as a savior, not as a ghost, but as a man who remembers what a foundation sounds like when it speaks. And somewhere, in the plant that had taught so many children to grow up into parents who could afford their promises, a machine cycled through its last hour of the shift without complaint. It had been tended to. It had been listened to. It would be ready in the morning. The correction did not announce itself with headlines. It settled into the building like a new climate, the way a coastline learns to live after a storm rearranges its dunes. The stewardship board did not swagger. It occupied the hours the way careful hands occupy a wound, not to impress onlookers, but to restore circulation. The sun's signature remained visible, but its ink now dried under a different kind of light. The father stood further back than rumor preferred and closer than pride once allowed, an old builder whose presence did not demand attention but directed it. The company breathed in counts that could be measured again. The days stopped auditioning for applause and returned to their first job, survival with dignity. The first discipline returned to the calendar. It arrived as a reintroduction of cadence, the weekly drum that keeps a line in step, even when each worker hears his own thoughts. Mornings in operations became less about dashboard glow and more about the faces that read those dashboards. The plant's music shifted half a beat, away from urgency that had learned performance, toward readiness that refuses to flinch. Machines responded to the change the way instruments respond to a musician who remembers to listen before playing. Bearings whispered gratitude in the absence of heat. Lubrication finally met schedules instead of crises. The floor supervisor began each shift with a brief ritual that replaced slogans with clarity about loads, hazards, and the single improvement each team would try before noon. The ritual took 7 minutes. The day gave them back an hour. Finance relearned humility. The spreadsheets that had once presented themselves like oracles stepped down from their altars and resumed life as tools. Assumptions were required to show their work. Forecasts were asked to introduce themselves to constraints before they were allowed to leave the room. The habit of rounding optimism upward gave way to the older habit of trimming exuberance at the edge. In a conference that did not invite cameras, the steward team placed a chart beside the door listing only 4 lines. Cash in hand, obligations that cannot move, obligations that can move if asked nicely, and the cost of pretending they can. A quiet accountability hung there like the smell of clean metal. Procurement became a mirror for character. The cousin contracts that had once walked into the house wearing borrowed confidence found themselves seated in chairs proportionate to their weight. No humiliation. No spectacle. Terms were remeasured with the tape that was used when the company could not afford illusion. Lead times were restored to the calendar instead of the wish. Discounts that required workers to sprint past safety were sent back to the store with a note that said, "We remember who we are." One supplier who had grown haughty in the season of applause was released with the respect owed to any relationship that has reached its honest end. Another who had been ignored because she did not understand how to flirt with trends was invited to the table and rewarded for knowing how to show up in February when others learned how to cancel. The foundation became evidence instead of decoration. In rooms that had once been arranged for photographs, folding tables appeared with spreadsheets printed in type large enough for elders to read without squinting. The scholarship clock shifted from gala to semester. Checks left the office before newsletters learned the vocabulary to describe them. The weekly meeting began with the ritual of a single story from the field that contained no adjectives and more addresses than adjectives would ever deserve. The son's wife learned to keep a pen that bled ink only when numbers had earned it. She stopped dressing the room to be beautiful and began dressing it to be useful. The air in those meetings felt like a basement after a storm pump had done its work. Legal returned to its first craft, guarding the edges so the middle can breathe. The clauses in the trust that had paused outflows and braced licenses did not remain tense a second longer than necessary. Pressure dissipated as the patient stabilized. The stewardship board met the bank with a tone that felt like a handshake between veterans. Lines were reset with maturities that hugged the company's actual seasons, not the seasons a pitch deck had painted when applause was still cheap. The old lawyer who smelled faintly of library paste and conviction drafted one page that described the boundary between prudence and fear. It was the kind of page that makes men sleep. The son's learning landed where learning must land to survive, on posture, not language. He stopped perfecting sentences and started perfecting questions that clocks respect. He stood on the mezzanine without pretending he had arrived to inspire anyone and watched cycle time argue with habit until one yielded. He wrote down the yield and brought it back to a team that had already discovered it. He returned credit to them in the currency of permission to change the work the way they actually needed to. He did not ask for loyalty. He earned it back one aligned wrench at a time. The wife's education took place out of frame. She carried a binder that did not perform elegance and filled it with names she had learned to pronounce correctly, because the people attached to them would not be treated like props anymore. She visited a school whose principal kept a spare shirt in his office because the boiler hissed unpredictability into the hallways. She listened to a nurse practitioner describe the tyranny of transportation in neighborhoods where opportunity came with an asterisk. She added a line item for bus passes and removed a line item for mood lighting. Her mother called with the tone of someone counting lost territories. She measured the call in her chest and returned to her list because lists like this are a devotion. The father observed the repairs the way a man observes someone he loves sleeping after an illness has broken. He did not wake the house every hour to check a fever that had already turned. He trusted the body. He trusted the structures he had built for nights exactly like this. He walked to the river to remind his bones that flowing water is not chaos. It is discipline obeyed at a speed your eyes call wild. He sat on his old bench and let the bench do what it did best, turn weight into belonging. The water did not applaud him, counseled him. It told him that elders belong when their being there no longer threatens the young's becoming. He nodded without needing a witness. And yet, even in recovery, temptations returned as if trying to renew a lease. An investor called with a scheme that turned years into quarters and quarters into a fault line disguised as a claim. The son brought the scheme to the room where the stewardship board kept silence like an instrument. Silence played first. Silence ended the pitch. The company kept its patience. A glossy trade magazine tried to resurrect the myth the house had stopped feeding. The writer asked for the drama of exile and the fireworks of return. The father offered instead the small miracle of routine well kept. The resulting article felt like a photograph of a heartbeat, flat to untrained eyes. True to those who understand that survival is not a headline, it's a room you keep swept. In operations, small mercies accumulated into resilience. The safety team replaced punitive posters with training that treated men and women like adults. Near misses were counted as data rather than as ammunition. A crane operator invented a hand signal that saved seconds without risking hands, and taught it to others without ceremony. Someone added a bench near the loading dock where elders could sit at the end of their shift and teach the young how to finish a day without taking rage home. The bench became a school disguised as furniture. In finance, a new habit appeared. The twice-monthly boring meeting. It had one rule: no speculation, only the discipline of current reality and the three nearest consequences. Attendance began as a chore, became relief, and matured into a culture anchor. Boring can be beautiful when you have survived being excited. The foundation drew a new map. It pinned pins where payroll had always outpaced pride, where a single reliable job multiplies into a neighborhood's back-to-school confidence. It measured impact not by applause but by second-year outcomes, by textbooks that did not return to pawn shops, by apartments that learned the smell of dinners cooked at 6 instead of 11. It taught the company how to speak again the language of the places that had trusted its name before the city learned to pronounce it with approval. The wife brought a proposal to the foundation board that surprised even her reflection. It replaced a gala with 6 neighborhood dinners spread across the zip codes the company had always claimed to care for. It required executives to sit at folding chairs and listen to stories that refused to be shortened. It assigned no photographer and asked for no speeches. It cost half and accomplished double. She walked out of that meeting lighter in the way people become lighter when they stop lifting facades. The father curated distance as a discipline. He let the son stand through silence that wanted to be filled with advice. He let him write the memo that acknowledged the errors of speed without spoiling it with shame. He let him make a small bet on a product line that had earned another try. And he let the loss teach the company the cost of nostalgia without letting the lesson stain. He allowed one of his oldest allies to retire rather than be reassigned, because part of stewardship is letting endings keep their dignity. At home, the widower kept rituals that make men durable. He cleaned his own kitchen not because he did not value help but because some tasks return a man to the floor where he first learned to do what needs doing. He polished the old radio and kept it tuned to the kind of station that still believed in announcing the farm report at dawn. He wrote letters to no one in particular and placed them in the drawer he called weather. He read from the notebook of daily lines and discovered, to his surprise, that the entries were getting shorter, not because the days lacked story, but because the story no longer required defense. He returned to the tree where his wife slept beneath the seasons and reported what had changed. He used the precise nouns she always preferred over adjectives. He told her the company was learning to be ordinary again, and that ordinary was a compliment in this house. He told her the son had started to carry a notebook with grease on it. He told her the daughter-in-law had turned a room full of mirrors into a corridor of doors. He told her the trust had held and then loosened. He told her he was ready, if asked, to leave the drawer closed for a long time. On a Thursday that wore the color of reliability, the stewardship board executed a planned retreat. Not the kind with slogans and catered epiphanies. A retreat in the literal epiphanies. A retreat in the literal sense, stepping back to see if the frame could hold without their hands. Contracts resumed their normal authority. The extra signatures retired until weather changed. Licenses flowed again through channels where accountability was a habit, not a surprise. The trust settled back onto its shelf with the satisfied creak of a book whose spine has been exercised properly. The company did not lurch. It absorbed the weight like a strong floor accepts dancing. The sun called a quiet gathering, not for a speech but for presence. Workers left the floor in staggered groups so the line did not starve. Supervisors found places to stand that did not suggest ownership of the air. Elders took chairs not to be honored but to ease their knees. He said only what the day required a leader to say, that the company had remembered itself and that remembering would now be their daily occupation. He did not seek absolution. He offered service. The applause sounded like hands, not like thunder. Hands are better. The wife organized the 6 dinners. Folding chairs multiplied on borrowed lawns. Paper plates held food that tasted like someone had not rushed. Children darted and rewrote the geometry of adult conversation. Men who had learned not to talk when cameras were present talked. Women who had always kept score with their backs rested against a truth that sometimes visited. A generator hummed like the old machines in the first warehouse. The father attended the last dinner and sat at the edge as he prefers, where exits are nearby and eyes can keep the whole scene. He watched a boy ask the son to sign a cap not because he was famous but because the boy's father had started coming home in a better mood. He watched the wife refill a stranger's cup and not take credit for it with her face. He watched the company re-enter the city without making the city pay for the visit. The rhythm set in. It was held. And because it held, capacity grew. The company took on one new client whose business fit their backbone instead of their fantasies. The plant added a shift that paired apprentices with veterans like family should have always done. The foundation funded a program that trained second chances into foremen. The safety board reached 100 days without a lost time incident and celebrated by not congratulating itself, by simply going to work the next morning as if prevention were the point, which it is. In the office, a simple plaque appeared beside the elevator on a wall that had once displayed awards welded from adjectives. The plaque carried 4 lines. Keep promises to customers. Keep people safe enough to go home whole. Keep the books honest enough that your grandchildren will not have to lie about you. Keep the name untraded. No one posed beside it. People read it on their way to places where the lines could be kept. The father considered the question he had been avoiding, whether readiness had now matured into the obligation to step away from proximity. Retirement, the second version. Not the exile attempted by a text, but the placement of a chair exactly where it belongs for a man who can still feel the roof through the soles of his shoes without needing to stand under it daily. He rehearsed the idea in the quiet room where he keeps the old radio company. He weighed it the way he used to weigh machinery, not by brochure but by balance. He tried the notion on his bones. They did not protest. He tested the idea in the plant by granting himself fewer interruptions. He walked the line without requiring the attention it was ready to pay him. He stood at the back of a training course where a young supervisor, once a kid who could not meet his eyes, taught a procedure as if he had written it in his own blood. He used the back exit that old men prefer because it saves young men the trouble of gratitude they do not yet have the words for. He passed the bench by the loading dock when it was empty and left on it a folded note that simply said, "Thank you for keeping the roof up." The son noticed the decrease and felt, not abandonment but endorsement. He took the endorsement carefully like a tool that can fix and wound depending on grip. He built further layers of habit around the gains, habits that would outlast moods. He asked the legal team to teach 3 managers how the trust worked in principle, not to give them access but to give them respect for structure. He brought his eldest to the plant not to perform lineage, but to show the child where dignity is minted without speeches. He declined an award he would have accepted last year and replaced it with a budget line for something with no press value at all. The refusal landed across town with the soft thud of a former self closing a door behind him. The wife, who had learned how to move without trying to be seen, called on a Saturday morning to ask the foundation if the pantry needed volunteers or checks, and listened carefully when she was told that this week it needed diapers and a plumber. She found both. The call lasted 3 minutes. She did not post about it. She wrote the names down anyway because memory must be trained like any other muscle the body wants to keep. The father returned to the river for the kind of conversation that water can hold without spilling. He asked the question he had asked himself privately for months and waited for the answer to move from idea to bone. The answer arrived as relief rather than as achievement. He understood that stepping back would not remove him from the house. It would place him more fully in the foundation, where he had always belonged. It would allow the son's weight to callous into strength. It would allow the wife's service to become her own, and not a favor to his legacy. It would protect the trust by letting it nap undisturbed. He went home and opened the drawer labeled Weather. He placed in it a new letter, written with a hand that had learned to write shorter sentences for truths that do not require decoration. The letter described conditions under which the stewardship board should return and the precise temperature of crisis that warranted waking the clauses he had put to bed. It described the sound of drift and the feel of waste and the ways pride disguises itself as caution. It ended with 2 lines his wife would have approved. If love must choose between being necessary and being good, it must choose to be good. If structure must choose between preventing harm and proving ownership, it must choose to prevent harm. He closed the drawer and did not lock it because locks are for fear, and he was done with fear. On a morning that smelled faintly of rain, deciding not to arrive, he called the son for a walk. They took the path by the river that had recorded their footsteps in different weights across decades. They said little because little was needed. They stopped at the bench that had held more decisions than any boardroom. The father named the time when presence would become attendance and attendance would become absence, not as an announcement, but as an offering. The son received it in the only way a man can receive a gift that removes a burden he thought he wanted, the way you receive shade when you have been pretending the sun is not burning you. They sat until the river taught them the difference between goodbye and transition. Then they rose and returned to the day, which had not paused for them and therefore would welcome them back precisely. In the weeks that followed, the company did not miss a step. That was the proof the father required. The stewardship board met once to review the criteria for its owner relevance and adjourned with relief. The bank sent a note that resembled trust. The foundation's calendars synchronized themselves with semesters and prenatal schedules and rent cycles so elegantly that no one noticed, which is the best compliment a calendar can receive. The plant's accident board remained blank for longer than anyone could remember, and men began to suspect that this was not luck. It was culture wearing boots. The message, the one that had tried to erase him, remained in the folder. Its power faded into pedagogy. He considered removing it as one removes a nail from a plank after the fence has held through wind. He left it where it was. Not as a wound, as a weather map pinned on the wall of a house that intends to see more seasons. In the evening, he returned to the room with the old radio and let it tell him the hour. Time had never been his enemy. It had been his roughest teacher and his fairest creditor. He placed his palm on the casing and felt the hum that had accompanied him across so many thresholds. He turned the dial to a station that sometimes went to static because static too reminds a man that clarity is a gift, not a guarantee. He stood by the window and watched the light give the city back to itself. He thought of the first machine that coughed to life under his hands and the last clause he had written to protect a future that could not yet say thank you. He thought of the son walking a floor whose noise has become a music he can finally hear. He thought of the wife writing quietly at a kitchen table, sending a message to a principal who once only received cancellations. He thought of a roof he could walk under without needing to announce that he built it. He turned the light off and let the house be dark without fear. The dark held him like the inside of a heartbeat. The company slept in security that did not pose. The family sat at a table that understood chairs as places to rest, not to rule. The city continued its argument with itself and remembered that some names keep their part of the bargain. The river negotiated with its banks and chose mercy again. The builder lay down and allowed fatigue to arrive without contest. He did not inventory the day. He did not rehearse tomorrow. He let the body be the ledger and the pillow be the receipt. The night passed with the cadence of something earned. The morning would keep its appointment. He had learned what power really means. It is not removal. It is return. It is the daily, unphotographed devotion to roofs and names and hands, and the quiet infrastructures that carry families across weather without asking the children to know the forecast. It is the mercy that writes clauses and the restraint that lets them sleep. It is the long obedience that trades spectacle for shelter. And beyond the window, the sky grew the color that factories love. A gray generous enough to keep glare out of the eyes and honest enough to tell you rain is possible. He woke with the ease of a man who will not be surprised either way. The day did not break. It arrived carefully, as if the sky had learned the company's new manners. Light filtered through clouds like a promise given without flourish. The plant opened its eyes in the sequence it trusted. Gates first, security next. Then the hum of machines waking one at a time, as if to confirm that breath should be a shared activity. The office took its stations. Spreadsheets stretched. Coffee remembered its work. People settled into their places with the measured ease of hands that had earned their uses. The company wore its steadiness like a uniform, not tight, not proud, simply correct. Beyond the gates, the market rehearsed a surprise and then decided not to rehearse at all. What the news called a correction was in fact a mirror. A major client, convinced by a trend that had mistaken speed for salvation, collapsed its orders into a funnel that led elsewhere. Another, who had been counting on money to forgive physics, skipped a payment with the apology of a note that admitted nothing. A ship drifted off schedule because a storm refused to consult calendars. A small factory in a distant town where the company purchased a specific hinge tripped over a power failure and fell into a week of silence. These were not catastrophes alone. Together they formed a language. The house could read it. The son stood in the windowed room that translated horizon into geometry and felt the old thrill of solving begin to stir, the one that used to confuse him into chasing applause. The thrill arrived and then behaved. Training held. He asked for the 4 lines that mattered: cash in hand, obligations that cannot move, obligations that can move if asked properly, and the cost of pretending they can. He received the numbers without narrative and let them sit on the table long enough to become useful. The elders entered without costume. Silence adjusted the room to working temperature. The father remained absent by design. The fail-safe had been built for days. Now the son must learn to approach it without trembling or worshipping. Downstairs, the plant changed nothing except attention. Supervisors shortened briefings to make room for tidying that prevents chaos later. Forklifts mapped comma routes. A maintenance tech who had learned to overhear stress in bearings moved with the quiet urgency of a person saving the future one spin at a time. On receiving, a clerk remembered a vendor whose truck always arrived with a driver who understood kindness as a logistics skill, and she called him first. The answer came back with laughter that sounded like weather-permitting cooperation. Inside small choices, a company tells its story. The foundation made the calls it had promised it would make when storms arrived. It prioritized rent over ribbon, prenatal visits over posture, textbooks over testimonials. The wife, who had traded spectacle for service, tightened a list that used to sing and now simply counted what was needed. She understood that shock travels through neighborhoods faster than through portfolios. She scheduled a pantry delivery 2 weeks early and learned the names of the drivers who would carry winter into kitchens. She marked a calendar not with events but with relief. She felt heavier and then strangely light, the way a person feels light when carried by a responsibility that finally fits. Mid-morning placed a paper in front of the son that no one else noticed at first. It was not a letter. It was the way a clause looks when it comes true. The trust, which had been loosened back into sleep during the recovery, stirred as covenants met weather. Liquidity must bend but not break. Lines must shorten and widen in unison. There is a tone to such awakenings, a low instrument playing beneath conversations that seem normal above them. The steward board looked at the son with eyes that knew what readiness felt like. He did not ask the father to enter. He entered the structure himself, as a caretaker enters a tool room that holds the implements meant to keep roofs in place. He turned to operations and asked for time the way men ask for rope, not to bind others, but to pull weight evenly. Time arrived in the form of rescheduled shipments and a rotation that moved midnight closer to morning where fatigue would not misprice judgment. He requested one favor of the plant. Tell me where we can slow down without bleeding. The plant told the truth as old friends tell it, gently without mercy. A line paused. A changeover shifted by 20 minutes. A team traded bravado for precision and discovered that speed is a dividend, not a starting point. Finance supplied the anatomy. Payables were sequenced into a choreography that honored those who had honored the company when it was young. The nephew contract, now competent but still green, received a schedule that would teach patience without punishment. The bank, remembering previous storms survived without theatrics, extended a line an inch, which is how professionals extend a hand without letting anyone fall. The son's signature found its shape, not big, not timid, a line that said I will stand inside the structure rather than on top of it. Legal restacked guardrails quietly. A licensing renewals list emerged with 3 colors, simple enough to understand without legend. Green meant the machine runs itself. Amber meant the machine runs checking the belts. Red meant to call the person whose name the founder wrote next to this line a decade ago, because he trusted their refusal to lie to him. The list left the room and returned with 2 greens shifting to amber, and 1 red settling into amber because one phone call placed with respect can turn a season. Midday, the failure of the distant hinge factory echoed. The part was small and unforgiving of improvisation. Alternatives existed only on paper, and in the memory of a retired machinist who had built the first jig with a cigarette in his mouth and a joke about God's preference for tolerances. The son did not panic. He asked for a name. The name was provided. The man answered on the 3rd ring with the voice of someone who had learned to keep his phone on, because the world sometimes needs you when your garden expects you. He came in by late afternoon, walked the line like history taking a stroll, looked at the print, and made a sound that meant this can be done if respect is paid to the time it will cost. A temporary jig took shape while the plant exhaled in small measurable breaths. The son watched and understood another chapter of the book his father had hidden in plain sight. The chapter's title was Elders Are Accelerants. The wife's day bent into its own complexity. The foundation's phones rang in clusters, questions arriving that never stand alone. If the paycheck comes late, will the daycare still hold the spot? If the bus pass runs out Wednesday, is there a bridge to Friday? If the electric bill is forgiven this month, will January be cruel in return? She learned that dignity is a spreadsheet populated with numbers that carry the weight of children's naps. She approved small sums with a seriousness formerly reserved for grand gestures, and discovered that seriousness is better when it moves quietly. Evening sloped toward the hour when confidence either naps or breaks. The son convened a review that contained nothing of performance. The elders spoke a language of corners checked and edges smoothed. The son summarized in 3 sentences that did not ask to be admired. He acknowledged the cost of the pause, named the reason, and pointed to the mechanisms that would absorb it. He explained to managers how to talk to their teams in words that keep a house together. He ended without a promise other than the one a man can make without lying. We will do what is necessary and we will not pretend. Across town, the father sat in the room with the old radio and did not turn it on. He measured the quiet and felt, with grateful exactness, that he was not needed urgently. A builder recognizes the difference between absence and vacancy. He walked to the window and let the evening lay the city out like a schematic. He thought of the clause he had written by lamplight when fatigue used to live in his wrists, the clause that declared a trust only useful when it trusts. He closed the curtain and let the day finish without him. There is a talent in elders refusing to steal a victory. The market rattled for another week. Then it decided to stop rattling and hum again. Orders returned not all at once but like travelers finding their way back after a detour. The line with the temporary jig kept its pace. The bank sent a note that resembled the earlier one with less caution and more confidence. The vendor who had tested patience apologized in the only language that matters for vendors: reliability. The foundation adjusted its schedule to match the smaller wave that followed the first, the reflex of a city exhaling slowly. When the room gathered to restore the loosened mechanisms to their original positions, the son deferred to the elders, and the elders deferred to the son. The trust subsided back into literature. The covenants returned to vigilance instead of posture. The stewardship board agreed to meet next season in a room with no table, only chairs facing a window, because sometimes the best policy review is remembering what it felt like outside before a storm arrived. The aftermath did not sparkle. Settled like good soil. Processes that had been improved under stress refused to deteriorate just because applause had left the building. The plant adopted a small ritual of gratitude at the end of every shift. Not corporate, not precious, simply the act of a foreman naming what went right and why, so that luck could not steal the credit. Finance kept the boring meetings. Legal shortened 3 documents by half. Procurement began writing 1-paragraph notes to small suppliers explaining why terms were what they were, and how change could be possible in 6 months. The wife scheduled the next pantry delivery before anyone asked. The son bought the retired machinist a bench plaque nobody would see except the people who needed the bench and therefore deserved to see the plaque. The father visited at noon on a day the sky wore the color of work. He walked the line and stopped where the temporary jig had stood, and then been replaced by the manufactured part. He touched the surface with 2 fingers as if greeting a tool like an old friend who had survived a scare. He watched for a minute the unremarkable miracle of cycles proceeding. No one noticed him immediately. He counted that anonymity as a measure of health. When a young tech finally turned, recognition arrived without performance. They nodded at each other across the small distance that separates generations when a house is well kept. He went upstairs and stood in the doorway as the son closed a binder that did not advertise itself with embossed letters. The room did not smell of victory. It smelled of paper that had done its job. The son did not rise quickly. He finished writing a line that deserved completion and then turned. Their eyes met with the ease of men who had stopped needing the other to prove anything. Nothing was said aloud. Everything necessary had taken place in the design and the restraint. The company settled into a steadier climb that refused to brag. The foundation settled into a cadence the city could believe. The wife, who had learned what kind of tired is holy, slept harder and dreamt less of rooms that see and more of kitchens that feed. The father allowed himself one indulgence. A small framed page on the study wall containing 4 lines he wished the world would memorize. Do not confuse speed with courage. Do not hire mirrors. Do not outsource memory. Do not let anyone spend the name. The turning point hardened into habit, which is the only way turning points matter. And because habit held, capacity increased again, not like a balloon inflating, but like a tree adding rings no one notices until the saw reveals them. A modest acquisition arrived, the kind that complements rather than conquers. It came with a workforce that had been taught to apologize for caring. The company removed the apology and let care keep the task. Productivity rose as if surprised by its own relief. The son used his chair sparingly, preferring to earn authority while standing. The wife continued to manage the quiet economy of relief, converting pronouncements into bus passes, speeches into grocery runs, meetings into warmer bedrooms. The father visited less and saw more, which is how elders are meant to measure their days. He kept the drawer labeled weather closed for longer stretches and when he opened it, found that the papers inside had grown older without becoming brittle. He added a page titled What to Do When I Am No Longer Here. It did not contain secrets. It contained habits written plainly, as if he were teaching a child to tie a knot that should never loosen under rain. A letter arrived from the client who had defected during the correction. It did not beg. It asked to speak the language of repair. The son met them without triumph and with boundaries. The price reflected respect instead of nostalgia. The service returned with the dignity of 2 parties who remembered why they began doing business together in the first place. The builder read the summary and placed it in the file where reconciliations go when they are not supposed to be paraded. The company celebrated none of this publicly. It held a cookout behind the plant instead, on a day when weather consented. No speeches found microphones. A line for food formed with the choreography of people who know how to share shade. A child ran with a ball and fell and got up because getting up was the only available ending. A small group of veterans from the early days sat in a cluster of folding chairs and told stories half accurately. Laughter made its reliable shape in the air. The father stayed for one plate and left before anyone could convert gratitude into ceremony. He waved at the bench and the bench did not wave back. Furniture remains nobler than theatrics. At dusk, the house grew its favorite color and the city remembered its patience. The father stood at the window with the old radio off and traced with his finger on the air the paragraph that had been written across the last months. A storm had tried to test them. A clause had tried to save them but discovered it did not need to finish the sentence because people had. He felt inside his ribs the loosening that follows a long faithful strain. He acknowledged, without words, a gratitude that would have embarrassed his younger self. He allowed the gratitude to remain unspoken. He believed in muscles that work better in silence. Night arrived like a friend who knows when to leave. He lay down and did not negotiate with sleep. The roof held above him with the ease of structure properly maintained. In the plant, a sensor blinked its approval. In the office, a binder closed itself by the logic of an ending that did not demand applause. In the foundation, a calendar advanced a square and carried forward a note about a boiler that still needed replacing. In the city, a boy finished homework under a lamp paid for by a check that did not post on any feed. In the river, water did what it has always done, chose the low road and proved that choosing the low road can shape the world. The turning point was complete. It left behind no slogan. It left behind a cadence. And in the morning, when light returned without ceremony, the company rose again with the humility of a house that knows the difference between shelter and spectacle. The sun rose with the measured appetite of a man who prefers useful problems. The wife rose with the list that keeps daycare and dignity on the same page. The father rose with the single ambition that remains honorable after a life of building, to keep the foundation taut enough to sing and slack enough to forgive. He dressed without thinking about how it looked. He poured coffee as if it were the first true miracle. He opened the drawer labeled weather and then smiled and closed it. Outside, a truck downshifted on the avenue, and the sound felt like an old friend making sure you're awake for what matters. He was. The roof thanked him by not leaking. The day thanked him by requiring nothing extraordinary and rewarding the ordinary like a king. The failsafe had met the storm. It did not need to roar. It needed to be remembered. And in remembering, it had taught everyone what power really means. Not the right to command but the devotion to hold. Morning refused spectacle. It arrived as it prefers to arrive in houses that have stopped auditioning for praise. Through the thin seam between curtain and frame, across the floorboards that remember every foot that ever asked them to hold. He woke before the kettle, before the city rehearsed its first horn, before the river reminded itself to keep moving because gravity has never missed an appointment. Sleep let go of him without argument. He did not reach for the phone. He reached for air. It met him like a handshake he had earned. Reflection does not begin with thoughts. It begins with hands. He smoothed the bed he had unmade, not out of tidiness, out of respect for a room that had kept his breathing steady while the company practiced the art of being ordinary again. The blanket knew his weight and forgot it immediately. He liked that about blankets. He liked it about roofs with the same promise to himself, to carry without complaint. He made coffee the way men do who have been forgiven for being dramatic, and have chosen not to repeat the offense. The kettle breathed, the mug warmed, the countertop offered itself as if it were still young. Outside, light spread across the street, found the gutter, found the curb, found the door he had repainted last spring when his wrists wanted to remember what a brush can teach patience. The door had kept its color. Reflection took attendance. Roof, door, bench, river, drawer labeled weather, old radio, son, wife, company, the name that had learned to be a noun and a verb. All present. He sat at the kitchen table and did what engineers do before they make a cut, they stare. Staring is not laziness. It is measurement conducted with the eyes. He measured the months that had followed the shattering. He measured the way silence, once a blade, had become a bomb. He measured the son's footsteps as they crossed from presentation to responsibility. He measured the wife's turn from mirrors to doors. He measured the company's pulse settling into a tempo that the weak call boring, and the wise call durable. He measured himself and found surface wear and interior strength, which is the correct ratio for men who intend to keep carrying their names without forcing others to carry them too. The kettle clicked. He poured. The cup filled like a document being signed by a hand that no longer needs flourish to be recognized. He lifted it, not to drink yet, but to feel heat remind the palms of a truth they always forget when wealth grows too quickly in a man. Everything important starts warm and goes cold unless you attend to it. He attended. The first sip did not ask to be described. He swallowed and let the body do what bodies do when given something honest. Reflection asked him to walk. He obeyed. The house unlocked itself with the quiet of trust. The hallway had learned to hold his shadow without multiplying it into ego. The photographs along the wall had not changed. The light on their glass had. He passed the one of the first warehouses, where sunlight used to fight its way through grime and wind by early afternoon. He passed the one of the ribbon cuttings, where a younger hand held scissors like a trophy. He passed the one of a small boy sitting on a pallet, legs swinging, looking up at a man who did not yet understand that you cannot teach legacy. You can only model it. He did not stop. Reflection is motion at the pace of truth. Outside, the air carried the faint smell of metal that factories exhale when they already know what the day will ask of them. He turned toward the river because water has always been kinder than applause. The path to the bench had collected leaves that had practiced falling without announcing tragedy. He liked leaves for that. They accepted instruction without becoming docile. He sat. The bench held him the way old friends do. No questions, all memory. He let his spine learn from wood. Across the water, a barge pushed past with the steady insistence of something that remembers load more than. He tried to remember the last time he had confused load with destiny. It was the year he wrote the first clause that people later called paranoia. He called it patience that refuses to be humiliated by preventable storms. He thought of that night. The way grief had sat on the edge of his desk after his wife's funeral and suggested he do something large enough to scare sorrow away. He had written instead. Not an essay. A mechanism. Reflection recognized the gift. He had built a way for love to continue working when love had no strength left to speak. He traced the air with one finger the way a machinist traces a tolerance he no longer has to check because muscle memory has taken over. The path of his finger drew a sketch in front of him. Warehouse, mezzanine, line 3, loading dock bench, elevator plaque with 4 lines, stewardship board now asleep, trust now quiet, Thursday repairs like stitches holding a garment close to skin, boring meetings like a heartbeat at rest, unphotoshopped wins like a ledger that insists on being honest, even when someone is watching. He smiled into the wind that had no reason to know that a man was smiling. He remembered the text. Reflection does not aim to forget. It aims to file correctly. The words that once sliced now lay flat inside him. He could pick them up without bleeding. They had become part of the architecture that held the roof up. He could even thank them, though he refused to do it out loud. Out loud would be vanity dressed in forgiveness. He would not wear that suit. He ran the sentence again in his mind, not to reopen, to test. It holds like lumber after the carpenter stops measuring and starts trusting. A runner passed with the gait of someone who had stopped negotiating with pain and started using it as information. He admired that. He admired it because he had not always practiced it. The year after the first expansion he had tried to outrun fatigue by acquiring more. The machines hummed. His body did not. He learned then what he had taught the sun without speaking. Speed is a debt. He had paid for it and he preferred cash. He rose and walked toward the plant, not to intrude, to be reminded. Buildings do not know who built them unless the builder behaves. He behaved. He entered at the employee door because ritual has to work at the lowest threshold or it isn't ritual, it's theater. The security guard nodded with the simplicity of someone who had seen every version of him and decided to stay. He crossed the floor. Sound arranged itself around him the way children arrange themselves around adults they trust to be quiet until needed. Motors sang the note that means heat will not be a problem today. Steel mocked gravity and won again. A clipboard lifted like a wing in a hand that had learned to fly in line through its shifts. He stood near the board where the unphotoshopped win lived each day like a small altar to the truth. Today it was a photograph of a wrench with a crack that would have shattered under the old schedule, and now had been retired before anyone had to pretend it was still safe. The caption dared to be boring. Brand replaced, torque reduced, nobody hurt. He loved that caption because it declared victory without applause. He would tell the bench about it later. The bench liked that sort of news. He found the quiet corner where the first machine he had ever purchased used to stand. That machine had learned its last breath long ago. The space had been repurposed into a training bay where apprentices learned to listen to motors by ear before they learned to read the diagnostic. He listened to a young man explain to another that hum can lie but rhythm cannot. He wanted to correct him. He did not. Reflection is the art of letting good errors teach better truths. Upstairs, he paused outside the room where schedules had taught chaos how to behave. He did not enter. He watched through glass as the sun stood not at the head of a table, but at the side of a whiteboard where the word check had been written in a hand that remembered chalk. The sun pointed not to a chart, but to a name that needed relief. The team moved 5 minutes from one block to another, which is how grown houses keep promises. He turned before anyone could turn to him. He had learned how to be present without being the point. The elevator had a plaque near it. He read it again because words change tone when the house changes weather. Keep promises to customers. The barge. Keep people safe enough to go home whole. The bench. Keep the books honest enough that your grandchildren will not have to lie about you. The drawer labeled weather. Keep the name untraded. The old radio, humming at the exact pitch of recognition. He touched the plaque with 2 fingers because superstitions, when attached to good sentences, become devotions. He kept walking. The break room had the replacement refrigerator humming the note that means food will not be turned into experiments. On the table, a lunch pail sat with the lid slightly ajar in the way that reveals a sandwich made by someone who loves. He saw a small drawing taped to a thermos, 2 stick figures and a rectangle that definitely wanted to be a truck. He allowed the drawing to rearrange his heart into a shape that could carry one more day. Reflection is a second heart learning where to stand. He drove to the foundation office next, because redemption without reflection becomes performance without depth. The room had learned to be useful. Tables that did not pretend to be heirlooms, chairs that could be stacked without guilt, a whiteboard where the schedule for relief lived in tidy lines that had practiced saying we saw you more often than we fund you. He stood by the bulletin where bus passes were tracked. He had never ridden a bus by necessity. He had ridden one once to remind himself he was not special. He touched the stack of passes with a care he reserved for only 2 other things: his wife's letters and the first paychecks he signed when he could not afford applause. The wife was not there. She had gone, he was told, to a school where the boiler had learned the dignity of silence. He pictured her at a table not unlike the one where he stood, writing down numbers that had nothing to do with galas and everything to do with boys who slept better when radiators do their quiet work. He did not put a hand over his heart. He simply placed a check in the tray without a signature line because the institution understood how to deposit without converting his giving into a slogan. Reflection prefers the invisible present. He left and drove the long way around the block where his mother used to sell bread. The corner store had not changed its name because it never had one. The door is still stuck at the bottom the way old promises stick. He parked and entered. The cooler he had purchased for them glowed like a small miracle disguised as an appliance. The owner, twice removed from the man he remembered, looked up and smiled without performance. He bought a loaf he did not need because memory has a price and it is always under market value. He left it in the passenger seat like a relic that did not require a church. Home again, the house took him back as if he had never left. He placed the loaf on the counter, unwrapped it, and breathed the smell that refuses to let men lie about hunger. He cut 2 slices to honor arms he had held and a third to honor arms he never got to hold long enough. He buttered one, salted the second, left the third bare, ate all 3 with the posture of someone being taught again by the simplest things. The knife tapped the plate, and the sound rang through the kitchen like a bell scheduling mercy. He walked to the study and opened the drawer labeled weather. The paper inside did not threaten. It rested. He lifted the letter he had written in Act 5 for whomever would come after him and reread the lines as if checking the welds on a bridge. He made one correction in pencil, a word replaced with a better one because words too deserve maintenance. He wrote in the margin a sentence he wished someone had handed him at 30. If you confuse urgency with importance, you'll spend the name trying to buy back sleep. He placed the paper back into its nest. The drawer closed with the soft click of wood trusting wood. The old radio waited. He turned the dial and found the voice that still announces the hour with a tone that refuses fashion. The voice told him time. He thanked it by listening all the way through the farm report because farms once fed the men who built the city that bought the machines that bought his youth. He turned the radio off and let the residual hum populate the room with an almost silence that made the next breath feel earned. He carried a notebook to the porch because reflection demands a ledger. He did not write paragraphs. He wrote a series of weights and measures only he would ever read. The first was for the son. Steadiness increased, posturing decreased, humility distributed, authority unperformed. The second for the wife. Service matured into habit, spectacle starved gently, mother's echo faded to a room you can visit without moving in. The third for the company. Cadence held, surprises localized, trust banked in the only currency that does not inflate, days kept. The fourth for himself. Presence corrected to proximity, pride harnessed to instruction, grief filed as gratitude. He underlined none of it. Reflection is better when left unadorned. Afternoon shifted the light into that clean bronze factories like because it frees sight from judgment. He put the notebook away and stepped into the yard. The grass had learned a patience he had lacked when he was 35. He opened the shed and found the brush he had used on the railing in spring. He dipped it into a can that had closed itself honestly after the last use. He painted the second coat he had promised in April and postponed in May and excused in June and remembered in July. The brush moved as if relieved to be asked. The wood was accepted. The rail thanked him by not splintering a hand that would touch it next week. Reflection uses paint when language becomes a distraction. The sun crossed one more invisible border. He washed the brush the way his father had shown him the day before the man forgot he had a son. The bristles relaxed into the shape that means they'll live to work again. He hung the brush the way you hang a promise. He closed the shed as if closing a story that did not belong in any book anyone else would read. Inside, he found the letter that had arrived from the client who had left during the correction and returned during the recovery. It lived on the counter under a magnet shaped like a truck his granddaughter had insisted he accept. He read the letter again, not to savor apology, to remeasure alignment. The client had described a mistake with the respect that errors deserve when they teach adults. He placed the letter in a folder marked lessons earned by both sides. Reflection is bilateral if done properly. He opened the fridge and poured water as if hydration were a sacrament. The glass sweated onto the counter and left a circle that wanted to be a moon. He wiped it because kitchens like to end days without proof of mistakes. The cloth smelled of lemon oil without the arrogance of perfume. He liked that too. Evening arrived. He went out again, this time without direction, and the city gave him one. Down the block where a neighbor he had never met was trying to fix a fence with a tool that did not fit the task. He offered a better tool without converting the moment into a lesson. The neighbor accepted. The fence was accepted. The evening was approved. He walked back slower than he had left, not due to fatigue, due to completion. Reflection always returns men lighter if they've carried the right weight. He sat at the desk for the 3-line ritual he had kept since the shattering taught him that days without receipts become myths. He wrote, "We were ordinary again today." He paused, considered adding something ambitious, chose not to, and wrote instead, "The bench held." He waited for words to arrive that were not sentimental. They arrived as a third line. The name did not ask for attention. He closed the notebook. The click of the cover became a small door closing inside him, the kind that means a room has survived. He visited the bedroom where darkness had learned to be a friend rather than a stage. He left the window open enough for the river to remember where his house was. He straightened the frame on the table with his wife's photograph, not to control it, to show it the kindness neatness sometimes is. He lay down, let the mattress distribute his history across its springs, and did not negotiate with sleep. Sleep, finally respected, came quickly and stayed without waking him for a review of imaginary disasters. The sun arrived before light completed its first sentence. He entered through the side door that smells faintly of raincoats and asphalt, the one supervisors use when a problem must be carried rather than announced. The staircase remembered him from his reckless years, then from his penitent months, now from his measured mornings. He had learned not to climb 2 steps at a time. He had learned not to make promises to gravity he could not keep. He had learned to place his hand on the rail the way you place a word carefully at the end of a sentence, not for emphasis, for honesty. Redemption, properly understood, is not the resuscitation of ego. It is the conversion of power into shelter. That conversion tested itself just past dawn when news arrived that a small subcontractor 2 counties away had folded without warning, the kind of collapse that leaves good people standing beneath a roof that suddenly forgets their names. The hinge shop that had saved them in the last storm had met a new storm of its own, an owner's failing heart, a lease that refused mercy, a creditor with a calendar instead of a memory. The call did not weep. It simply informed. Redemption, if real, would need to answer with hands rather than slogans. The Sun gathered the only committee that matters when a company intends to remain human, the one without a name, the one that meets in hallways, the one that breathes. He moved through operations first and opened the map where capacity has been quietly stockpiled by people who prefer prevention to heroics. A training bay could become a microline for a month. A night shift could stretch 10 minutes without stealing sleep. A vendor 3 hours south had old jigs in storage that could be convinced to remember their purpose. The calendar did not panic. It rearranged itself with the grace of a dancer who knows the stage better than the script. Finance did not protest. Redemption had taught accounting the difference between thrift and stinginess. A reserve existed, not for acquisitions, not for confetti, but for days like this. It was a plain number named for weather. Legal confirmed that contracts could flex in the direction of decency, without breaking in the direction of foolishness. Procurement called the hinge shop's workers, not to hire them like a raid, but to ask what dignity would require if help came. Redemption moved by asking first. By mid-morning, the plan existed in pencil. The factory would absorb the hinge work for a quarter, not as an act of saviorhood, but as a collaboration that allowed the smaller shops people to land without losing their names. The Sun approved with a nod that had learned to be neither timid nor theatrical. The board would be told at noon in the language that after months of correction had become habit. Not opportunity, not risk, but our obligation to the ecosystem that once spared us. The Sun did not call his father. He did not need to. The architecture that old hands leave behind has a way of answering the phone without making a sound. In the foundation office, the wife sat with a list that had turned from nouns into verbs. The calendar was no longer a parade of events. It was an engine. She had folded bus passes into daycare hours, tuition into tool stipends, heating subsidies into after-school light that lets homework become less of a guess. The letters on her desk told stories with receipts. A repaired boiler that stopped sounding like a cough. A nurse certification completed because someone paid for silence where noise would have humiliated. A library's Saturday hours returned to a neighborhood that remembers how to treat books. She had learned to read need the way the plant reads heat. She did not perform empathy. She arranged it. Redemption asked something sterner of her that afternoon. A note came from the principal of the school whose radiators no longer scolded. A spill of children had arrived without lunches 3 days in a row. The cafeteria budget had misjudged a new wave of enrollment by the exact number of families who had left the hinge shop. The crisis was not dramatic enough for headlines. Too daily for donors who prefer ribbon to bread. She stared at the number, then at the map, then at her pen. Her hand did not tremble. She moved funds from a postponed photo exhibit to a line called Immediate Nutrition. She phoned a grocer who never says no when asked for milk and bread with respect. She reprinted the calendar so Thursday morning would include food that doesn't advertise itself, only sustains. Redemption wrote itself into sandwiches and cartons. By late afternoon, the plant had reconfigured a bay. Machines that had once learned hinges decades earlier recognized the task the way bodies recognize chores learned in childhood. A retired machinist returned as a teacher and stood with 3 apprentices at a table that smelled of cutting oil and second chances. The first hinge out of the jig bore a tiny burr at the edge that would have cut a finger in a careless house. The apprentice who caught it logged the catch on the unphotoshopped board without being told. The photograph looked like nothing if you do not know what to see. If you do, it looked like a child arriving home with unbled hands because a stranger did his job. In the break room, a calendar had been left with an empty square for Thursday's pantry delivery. The wife arrived with a list, not a speech, and a timetable, not a plea. She set boxes beside the refrigerator that no longer mutinied against lunches. Someone asked who had paid for all this. The room, which had matured into a democracy of gratitude, offered the correct answer. We did. Redemption spreads its pronouns carefully. Evening folded the light into the edges of the building. In the founder's house, the old radio named the hour in a voice that has no interest in trending. He sat by the window and practiced stillness as contribution. The bench at the loading dock carried people and weight and stories. He imagined it the way architects imagine beams when they've stopped needing to visit the site every day. He allowed his bones to believe that usefulness no longer required movement. That belief did not diminish him. It rendered him true. Redemption's sternest work arrived the next week. A worker on line 3 collapsed at noon. It was not a spectacle. The body has its own calendar and sometimes forgets to consult the supervisor. The team responded the way a house with good rituals responds, quickly, precisely, without converting urgency into panic. Paramedics came and left with professional promise. The shift was sent home an hour early without anyone having to ask. Insurance, which often behaves like a negotiator who does not understand grief, was asked to behave like a person. It did because the company learned to choose carriers who can be educated. The son visited the hospital and did not perform compassion. He sat in the hallway outside a room where tubes spoke the language of trying. He texted no one photos. He wrote no proclamations. He waited alongside a spouse whose face had learned how to hold hope without cracking. He called the foundation not to expedite anything, but to inform a network that could quietly arrange meals and rides in silence in places where noise would revert to superstition. The nurse came out and offered the kind of news that belongs only to the people who must carry it. The son stood, not because his presence changed anything, but because the body knows how to honor the sacred without being told where the altar is. The wife increased the flow of small things. Snacks went to a house where children were learning how to sit very still near a phone. Utilities were promised their patients would be repaid. A principal added a note to Friday folders that reminded parents of a free babysitting hour on Saturday morning for those who needed to cry alone or get the oil changed. The note did not say cry. People who need such minutes read between lines fluently. Redemption respects the literacies grief teaches. Days later, the worker returned to the plant in a borrowed strength. The break room made space without parade. The unphotoshopped board featured a photograph of a chair placed near the window with a view of something growing. The caption read less than anyone expected and more than anyone needed. A foreman added a small rule to the pre-shift ritual. Water breaks would be watched with the attention once reserved only for output. The line learned, and then the line remembered, and then the line did not need reminding. Redemption becomes policy when it stops needing meetings. The hinge plan matured into a plan for people. The small shop's workers folded into the plant like cousins, who know how to be grateful without becoming servile. Some stayed. Some returned to their town when the owner's son found a way to reopen with smaller rent and better hours. The company sent back the jigs without ceremony and kept the relationships with intention. The ledger carried numbers, but the file held a different currency, a list of names with notes about allergies, spouses, church dinners, late buses that require a schedule's mercy. Redemption keeps ledgers that do not fit inside accounting. The wife received a letter from a student who had graduated because a bus pass became a promise rather than an errand. The letter did not praise anyone. It described a morning where keystrokes made more sense because hunger was not present to distract the brain. She considered pinning it on the wall. She folded it instead and placed it in a drawer labeled future. Not weather. Future. She had earned a second drawer. The founder walked the river and greeted the barge with the courtesy one gives an old animal that can still move. He sat on the bench and let the body rehearse gratitude without turning it into prayer. He watched a boy on a bicycle learn to balance by aiming through rather than at. He saw in the boy's small wobbles the long arc of the company's last year. He approved of the mechanics, less correction by yanking, more correction by continuing. Redemption's physics are gentle and relentless. He thought of the text again, not with resentment, not with triumph. He thought of it as a tool, crude, necessary, unpretty, that pried loose what pride had nailed wrong. He imagined placing it on a shelf in a workshop beside other instruments used for ugly tasks that end beautifully. He labeled the shelf in his mind with a sentence his wife would have permitted. For emergencies that will teach us anyway. He smiled at the empty air as if it had deserved an answer long ago. Redemption nudged the name itself into a different posture. Customers used it without italicizing. Vendors pronounced it without negotiation. New hires learned to say it without fearing what it might require of them. The name had lost the brittle edge of branding and gained the soft authority of reputation. It moved through the city the way good water moves through pipes, unremarked upon by those warmest because of it. A letter arrived from the bank. It was short and respectful and dull. The interest rate softened a hair. The covenants nodded and returned to their chairs. The line of credit renewed as if renewing were the same as remembering. The founder appreciated the dullness. He filed the letter beside another that had once refused him long ago. He labeled the pair with a title that only he would read correctly, proof that patience is a better negotiator than charisma. The son institutionalized humility. He did it without making an initiative out of it. He asked the training team to add to orientation a walking tour not of offices, but of thresholds. The side door where supervisors enter, the bench by the loading dock where grown men cry without spectacle, the unphotoshopped board where truth declines makeup, the plaque by the elevator where 4 lines hold the roof up, the foundation office where bus passes are counted like sacrament, the first machine that no longer exists but can be heard if you stand quietly where it once stood. New hires finished that tour and joined a house rather than a payroll. Redemption is a map you teach with footsteps. The wife kept tightening the loop between gift and result. She learned to ask for reports that did not flatter. How many boilers now breathe without coughing? How many lunches arrived without embarrassment? How many apprentices returned for their second month because the bus did not betray them? How many mothers slept at least 6 hours in a week because childcare synchronized with shifts? She required that the numbers be as boring as possible. She required that the stories be permitted only when they were written by those who paid the cost of them. She refused triumph. She requested continuity. The calendar complied. Late in the season, the storm everyone expected did not arrive. In its absence, the plant discovered the thrill of calm, a sensation that no one advertises because it doesn't win awards. The Thursday repairs ritual spread to offices and then to the foundation and then to homes. On Thursdays, people fixed one small thing. A hinge on a cabinet, a sentence in a manual, a habit of checking email too late, a way of speaking that made someone smaller. The ripple widened until the river itself felt included in the plan. On a Sunday, the founder cooked. The pan remembered that he has always preferred butter to oil when feeding sorrow. He made eggs as if he were repairing a day that had not yet broken. He salted them at the right moment before removal, because timing is what turns ingredients into something worth the plate. He ate slowly and reviewed no spreadsheets in his mind. He allowed himself one indulgence. A day in which he would not prepare for anything. The house survived. The city survived. The company, bored in the way strong things bore the world, thrived. Word came that the small hinge shop had reopened under a new name that kept the old one's initials. The owner's son sent a photograph of an open door and a broom. The founder printed it and taped it inside the cabinet where he keeps sugar. He liked the ritual of finding redemption's evidence beside sweetness. He considered telling someone. He didn't. Some satisfactions are spoiled by conversation. Redemption wrote a final test, not dramatic, surgical. The family that had once exiled the father from a dinner prepared a table without consulting screens. Chairs were placed badly and then corrected. A child insisted on placing forks with the tines the wrong way, and was permitted in honor of persistence. The wife cooked something she had learned from a neighbor at one of the dinners in the neighborhoods where the foundation had become part of the furniture. The son set the old radio on the counter and tuned it to a station that still calls out the time at the top of the hour, letting the voice mark arrivals and departures like bells in coastal towns. The father arrived last and first, last to enter, first in everyone's mind. They ate. They did not discuss legacy. They poured water and passed bread and listened to a story about a field trip that had resulted in shoes caked with museum mud. The father watched the son perform the liturgy of small kindnesses with a competence that did not request audience. He watched the wife collect plates and return them in quieter stacks. He watched the name soften into a room that would sustain itself even when he left. He did not say thank you. He made the coffee. In that house, that act had always meant the same thing. Night slid in with the modesty it reserves for homes that do not require its drama. The old radio named the hour again. The voice did not intend poetry, and that made the sentence perfect. The father reached for his coat and stood in the entryway long enough to smell wood and steam and citrus and a starch he associated with tablecloths from a decade when he could not afford tablecloths. He opened the door, said nothing to the air, and stepped into the street as a man does when the street knows his stride. He passed his hand across the door, as if to flatten a wrinkle that existed only in memory. He walked toward bed, toward the bench, toward the river, toward the drawer labeled weather that no longer calls to him in the night. On the bench the next day, a stranger sat where he usually sits. The stranger did not move and should not have. The founder sat at the other end without ritual, looked at the river and practiced a gratitude that requires no witness. The stranger rose and left a newspaper folded to a page with a story no one would read twice. An announcement of a small grant to a community college for second shift classes. The photograph accompanying it was badly lit, the headline unremarkable, the content precise. The founder did not pick up the paper. He had already read it, in the lives of men whose names his company pronounces correctly. He returned home and opened the drawer labeled weather. He took out the text he had printed months ago. He unfolded it the way mechanics unfold a schematic they have long since memorized, not to learn again, but to honor the object that helped build the habit. He placed it on the desk and laid a single paperclip across it like a bridge. He wrote on a small card the words his wife would have written on the back of a photograph. Taught us something. He placed the card on top, slid the stack back into the folder, and closed the drawer without letting it click loudly. In the evening, the city breathed out steam that lifts from vents like confessions that no longer need to be hidden. The plant dimmed one light at a time and refused to blaze out as if existence required spectacle. The foundation calendar printed tomorrow and left the printer warm. The bench cooled and did not complain. The river forgot the names of those who had watched it and kept faith anyway. Redemption, in the end, had not rewritten anyone's biography. It had rewritten everyone's habits. The son had learned to place humility where charisma once paced. The wife had learned to replace mirrors with doors and then to oil the hinges so the doors would not squeal when opened at odd hours. The company had learned to schedule decency and watch yield rise because of it. The founder had learned to keep watch without guarding, to care without claiming, to love without requiring gratitude as a tax. He sat by the window and let the old radio announce the end of the day. It spoke the hour. He believed it. He turned the knob and let silence become the final sentence. He walked to the kitchen, closed the cabinet where sweetness hides, and went to bed in a house that no longer kept secrets from itself. Redemption had finished one kind of work and begun another, the kind that will not need his name to be recognized, the kind that will multiply without advertisement, the kind that children will one day describe clumsily while pointing at a bench or an elevator plaque or a clean lunchbox or a bus pass or a hinge that does not cut the hand of the person who installs it. Morning waited on the other side of the wall with its familiar gentleness. It would arrive. It would not knock loudly. The house would open from the inside. The city woke that morning the way healed wounds wake. Tender but functional. Steam climbed through vents. Buses sighed into motion. Factory lights blinked awake without fanfare. The company, that once trembled under pride and resentment, hummed now like a patient organism that has accepted its heart's rhythm. No applause. Just pulse. In the founder's house, dawn did not arrive. It returned. It slipped in through the thin crack between curtain and frame, the same way it always had, carrying the same honest light that had once watched him struggle, rise, fail, forgive, and rebuild. He woke to that light and didn't move immediately. Stillness had become his discipline. The world outside would not collapse if he rested 5 more breaths. He had earned those breaths. He sat up slowly, his hand of the notebook that had been his confessor through storms, the notebook where each day had ended in 3 lines. He opened it to a blank page. The paper waited like a servant who knows his master's silence is a form of speech. He wrote nothing. For the first time in decades, the morning entry could afford to be wordless. Outside, a robin perched on the branch of the tree that had watched him repaint the back steps 2 acts ago. The bird tapped its beak twice against the bark, a sound small enough to remind him that continuity is sometimes disguised as repetition. He smiled at that thought. He had built empires on repetition, one hinge, one beam, one habit at a time. Now repetition was his peace. He dressed without ceremony. The mirror offered no verdict, only reflection, the kind that asks, "Do you still recognize the man who built the roof you now live under?" He did, but not in the way he once did. Recognition had changed shape. Once recognition meant seeing himself as the architect. Now it meant seeing himself as one of the bricks. He walked to the kitchen and brewed coffee in the old machine that hissed like an old friend pretending to complain. The radio spoke from its corner. The same announcer's voice, the same hour called out. "It's 6:30, and the weather looks merciful." He chuckled quietly. Even the city was learning mercy. The company's morning began as his mornings used to, with the discipline of precision. Trucks moved like punctuation marks on a sentence written in steel and rubber. The river behind the factory glistened, calm now, a mirror more than a current. Inside, the sun was reviewing numbers but as practice. His pen moved across a report with the kind of patience that comes from understanding that leadership is maintenance, not spotlight. He had become his father's echo, not his imitation. Beside him, the wife reviewed schedules for the foundation's next quarter. Her handwriting was steadier than before. The sharp, anxious loops had softened into curves that understood endurance. She had begun to sign documents without needing reassurance that the act would be noticed. On the wall of her office, a photograph hung, one of the new classroom wings they'd funded at the vocational school. Beneath it, a note written in a child's uneven hand. "Thank you for giving my mom time." That sentence had replaced her mother's approval as her North Star. Across the city, the world kept its quiet promises. Attend, the son called a meeting. Not for crisis. Not for strategy. Just for stewardship. He gathered his managers, the veterans and the apprentices alike. He began the session with the ritual his father had created, reading one note from the unphotoshopped board. Today's note was simple. "We found an old wrench that still fits the new bolts. Some things don't outgrow usefulness." He read it slowly, the way you'd read a prayer. Then he folded the paper and placed it back under a magnet shaped like a gear. "Let's stay that way," he said quietly. "Useful." The word hung in the air. Small, unpretentious, invincible. Meanwhile, in the founder's home, the hours moved differently. He took his coffee to the porch and let the sunlight rest on his hands. Hands that had drawn blueprints in the dirt, sealed contracts with sweat, built shelters out of discipline and clauses. They looked older now, the veins like rivers finding home, the skin like parchment carrying old signatures. He lifted his hands to the light and smiled. "You've done your time," he whispered. He set the cup down, stood, and began his daily walk, slow, deliberate, reverent. The path took him past the street where the bakery still stood, the one his mother once managed. It still smelled of yeast and purpose. A new sign hung above the door, under new ownership, same recipe. He smiled at that. Continuity again. He stepped inside, bought a single loaf, and held it the way believers hold relics. "Still the same?" the baker asked. He nodded. "Still the same." He paid, left, and tore off a small piece as he walked, letting crumbs fall into the street for pigeons, as if feeding memory itself. At the factory gate, security greeted him with the ease of routine. No special salute, no announcements. Just a nod, the nod that says, "We remember who built this and we respect how you left it." He walked across the floor. The smell of oil and metal filled his lungs. It no longer smelled like ambition, it smelled like home. Machines worked with the grace of discipline. Workers moved with the rhythm of belonging. His place redemption had unfolded months before. A young man, maybe 25, was adjusting a machine. His sleeves were rolled up, his fingers blackened with grease, his face calm. The founder watched him and thought, "That's how you know you've built something right, when the next generation looks busy instead of lost." He turned toward the mezzanine. His son stood there, speaking with an engineer, gesturing with hands that no longer trembled with performance. Their eyes met across the floor. No nod this time. They didn't need it. Recognition had become a shared silence. He made his way to the bench by the loading dock, the faithful bench that had heard every confession. It was still there, still scarred by weather, still loyal. He sat down. The river reflected clouds that moved like unhurried thoughts. He watched a barge drift, loaded with timber, heading downstream. He had once believed destiny was upstream, the climb, the grind, the uphill proof. Now he understood. The journey is downstream. The test is in the letting go. He leaned back, hands folded, eyes closed. The hum of the machines reached him faintly. The air tasted of iron and grace. In the foundation office, the wife was finalizing a new clause for the organization's charter, one she titled, "The Thursday Code." It read, "Every Thursday repair something that no one else will thank you for." She printed it, framed it, and hung it near the door where every employee would see it leaving. Her reflection in the glass was softer now, not because the light had changed, but because the mirror no longer needed to become the thing she had once envied, invisible goodness. Back in the plant, the son was approached by the union steward. They exchanged a short conversation about the new schedule, shorter shifts, longer weekends, same pay. The steward said, "That'll cost us a little margin." The son smiled. "It'll save us people. Margins can recover. People can't." The steward nodded. "Your father would have said that." He did, the son replied. I finally listened. The steward didn't answer. He just reached for a wrench on the table and set it in its proper place. That was answer enough. That evening, as dusk folded over the factory like a gentle blanket, the founder returned home. The air smelled of rain that had decided not to fall. He placed the loaf of bread on the counter and turned on the radio. The announcer's voice, same as ever, read the weather. A clear night, mild winds, steady skies. He nodded. Good, he said. The house can sleep. He sat at the table, tore a piece of bread and buttered it. The butter melted slowly, like memory releasing its grip. He ate in silence. He didn't need company. The house itself had become company. Later he walked to his study. The drawer labeled weather waited. He opened it one last time. Inside were the letters, the clauses, the notes, the photograph of the old warehouse, the page from the hinge shop. The tin looks at tools that have completed their work. He didn't need them anymore. He placed a single slip of paper on top, written in his firm, unshaking hand. Everything held. He closed the drawer slowly. This time it clicked. Finality disguised as closure. Outside, the sky shifted from gray to indigo. He stepped onto the porch and watched the first stars blink awake. Humble, punctual, unbothered by how small they looked from below. He whispered to them, "You've always known the script." The stars said nothing, which is the language of agreement. He felt a breeze move through his hair. The same wind that had carried the smell of steel for 50 years now carried the smell of forgiveness. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with all of it, the past, the peace, the proof. He exhaled. That breath was the sound of a legacy exhaling through him. The next morning, the house found him still on the porch, the radio still murmuring the hour. The cup beside him empty. The dawn arrived exactly as planned. The sun, when he came later that day, did not panic. He stood at the doorway and knew. He did not cry loudly. He did not call anyone. He simply sat where his father had sat, picked up the notebook and read the last page. There were no words. Just the impression of a pen that had rested there too replaced writing. He smiled. "You did it," he whispered. "You really did." He placed his hand on the cover and closed it, gently, reverently, the way one closes a promise. The funeral was small, unadvertised, perfectly proportioned to the man's last years. No speeches. Only the quiet assembly of people who had known what he built and who he became. The son carried the urn himself. The wife stood beside him, holding a single white rose. The workers from the plant came wearing their uniforms, each with the 4-line plaque's words pinned to their chest. Keep promises to customers. Keep people safe enough to go home whole. Keep the books honest. Keep the name untraded. They said nothing. They stood as the wind carried his ashes toward the river, the same river that had carried his dreams downstream decades earlier. The current accepted him as one of its own. Weeks passed. Then months. The company kept running, precisely, quietly, endlessly. The son never changed the systems, only refined them. The wife expanded the foundation, not bigger but deeper. The plaque in the elevator gained one new line, added by unanimous consent. Keep mercy in the structure. No one needed to explain what it meant. Everyone already knew. The bench by the loading dock remained. Workers began leaving small tokens there, a cap, a wrench, a folded piece of paper with the word thanks. No one collected them. They stayed until the rain carried them away. Every Thursday, someone polished the plaque by the elevator without being told to. Years later, a journalist visited the plant to write a story about legacy manufacturing, expecting quotes about innovation and resilience. Instead, she got stories about sandwiches, bus passes, Thursday repairs, and an old man who once refused to fire anyone during a recession. When she asked what had changed most since those days, the son said, "Everything except what mattered." She tilted her head. "And what was that?" He smiled. "The roof still holds." She wrote her article. The headline was simple: "The company that forgot to die." It went viral for a week, then faded. But inside the factory no one cared. They had never needed headlines to know their worth. Time, patient as ever, did what it does best: it blurred edges. The founder's name on the building weathered into patina. The letters dulled to bronze. The son grew older. The wife's hair silvered. The bench acquired more scratches. The drawer weather stayed closed. But the hum, the sacred hum of the plant, remained unbroken. Every shift ended with that sound, and every morning began with it. The name lived not on paper, not on metal, but in the invisible faith that threads through a place that's learned decency. One evening, the son visited the bench with his own child, a boy about the same age he had been when he first played among pallets. The boy asked, "Did Grandpa really build all this?" The son nodded. "Why?" He thought for a moment. Because he believed roofs should last longer than applause. The boy didn't fully understand, but he smiled. The son smiled too. "One day you will." They sat together until the lights of the plant blinked off one by one, a soft Morse code spelling closure. Far downstream, the river moved the way truth always does, quietly, faithfully, unnoticed by most. Somewhere in that current, maybe in the molecules that once were him, mercy kept flowing. It brushed the hulls of barges over rails to watch the water. Every current carried a whisper. Keep the name untraded. Keep mercy in the frame. Keep the roof holding. Night returned as it always does, not to end the story, but to remind the city that some light belongs to memory, not to bulbs. The house on the hill where it all began still stood. Inside, the radio clicked softly at midnight and spoke one last time into the empty kitchen. "It's a clear night, and the weather looks merciful." The sentence hung in the air like a benediction. And somewhere, in the breath between silence and dawn, the house answered back. By not creaking, by not leaking, by simply holding. The roof thanked him the only way roofs know how. By staying. They erased him once with a message. He replied with a legacy that needed no reply. He left behind no monument, only mercy, written into steel, clauses, benches, and hearts. Power spoke softly, and when it stopped speaking, the